Hello, I'm Christina Davis, Director of the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations. I am really excited. This is our last session of the year, and it is going to be wonderful because we have a very special guest with us. Sheila Smith, who is the John Merow Senior Fellow of Asia Pacific Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations, an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Asian Studies program. She's going to be presenting new research on uncertain boundaries, Northeast Asia's post-war settlement and the Northern Territories. This is a topic very near and dear to my heart because in college I wrote a paper on the Northern Territories. It's one of my first research papers. And in Japan, my favorite place to visit is Shidetoko National Park, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Park. It's a beautiful natural heritage park, but it is also the viewing place for this disputed territory of the Northern Islands, which is an important issue to discuss. And it's really exciting to know that the leading scholar of security policy and US-Japan relations is turning her attention to this topic. As a way of a little background, the Northern Territories are the 4 islands that you can see from the Shidetoko National Heritage Park: Habomai, Shikotan, Kunashiri, and Etarofu, which are collectively known in Russian as the Kuril Islands. They have been subject to competing claims from Russia and Japan for centuries. Japan takes the position they have always been the inherent territory of Japan, and that the Soviet Union has illegally occupied them since 1945, when it seized the territories in the closing days of World War II. The Soviet Union and now Russia also have territorial claims that they say go back in history. In 1956, the 2 countries did conclude the Soviet-Japanese joint declaration, which ended the state of war between the 2 countries, restoring diplomatic relations. But they have not concluded a peace treaty. Negotiations between the Japanese and Soviet, now Russian governments have continued with the goal to establish a peace treaty which would resolve this ongoing territorial dispute. The former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe especially put renewed attention. There have been decades of negotiations across many administrations, but it was an especially important issue to Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who tried to get a conclusion to the issue and held a summit meeting with President Vladimir Putin, taking him to his hometown. Even with this high level of attention, they were unable to conclude a deal. It was seen as a very dramatic turning point for Japanese foreign policy when the Prime Minister Kishida lined up immediately after the Russian invasion of Ukraine to side with the government of the United States and Europe to impose comprehensive sanctions on Russia, knowing that this was likely to stop all future prospects for a progress on the negotiations over the Northern Territories. And indeed, with the imposition of sanctions, Russia immediately stopped talks on the islands. The issue is entirely unsettled, and therefore it's a topic rich for discussion and in need of deep attention by scholars. And so we are really excited that Sheila Smith is here to talk with us about these issues. She is the author of many books: The Intimate Rivals, Japanese Domestic Politics and a Rising China, came out in 2016. She's also written on Japan Rearmed, The Politics of Military Power, from Harvard University Press in 2019. And she has written a CFR report on Japan's new politics, the US-Japan alliance. She has many, many more articles that I cannot list here. She has also been a big supporter of our program, giving many events for the program, including serving as our distinguished visitor a decade ago. Our event today is co-sponsored by the International Security Program of the Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Please join me in welcoming Sheila Smith.
Thank you so much. I can't tell you how delighted I am to be up here and to see so many of you here interested in Japan, not just the US-Japan relationship, but also all things Japan and all things Japan and foreign policy in particular. Last time I came up Professor Susan Farr was directing the program, and Susan, thank you. It's delightful to see you with us, and Shin Fujihira. Also, thank you for all of your help always. So I am turning my attention to this topic in the Northern Territories for two reasons. And this is just by way of introduction about how this fits into my research. One is, as you may know, we talk an awful lot these days about the liberal order or the post-war order and how it's being challenged. Most of the ways of those of us in international relations theory think about that is the rise and fall of great powers. We think about it in that kind of frame. But I wanted to sort of, and you, those of you who know my work will know that I like to get a little bit different take on the agency, the people and the groups and the actors that shape foreign policy choice. I'm not so keen on the mechanistic, one power rises, the other one falls, and therefore everything has to be redefined. There's a process by which ideas are challenged. And often those ideas are challenged not by rising China or by Vladimir Putin's Russia, although we can talk about that and I hope we will, but it's also challenged by citizens. And this project, therefore, this is one chapter of a larger book project that's looking at the fraying of the post-war order in Northeast Asia. And we'll look at both Japanese, South Korean, and Taiwanese experience. I wish I could look at China, but unfortunately, that's not a place where we can go and ask the kinds of questions that I'm looking at. But I think Taiwan will be an interesting case study of that. But this is one area, these uncertain boundaries, that I think is going to be, most of you have read about them at one point or another, whether it's the Senkaku Island dispute between Japan, China, and Taiwan at one point, or it's the Dokdo dispute between South Korea and Japan, or now to the north, the Northern Territories, which has been probably the most conspicuous island dispute in the post-war period. Now, I thought I would, just by way of very simple introduction of how am I going to go at this topic of thinking about an order and then who challenges it. Let me start with slide one. Let me just one little footnote. I don't know how many of you have been to Merow. This is in Merow City. I went there last November. So some of the photographs you'll see are me taking you along with me on that trip. But I was going to visit the Coast Guard, interview the Coast Guard. And one of the first signs I saw, street signs I saw, was this. And I had to stop my car and pull it over and take a picture because it's written in Japanese, Romaji, obviously Romanized Japanese, but also it's written in Russian. And all of the major intersections in Merow City, especially around the fishing port, they are all presented bilingually or trilingually, if you count Romaji as a different language. But so the Russian influence on Merow is actually quite large. Right. So there are Russian families who lived there in the past. There are people who raised their children there. So there's a lot of toing and froing, despite what I'm going to talk to you about, which is the politics of the issue. At the local level, there's an awful lot of engagement, and there has been since the early 1990s. But let's talk about orders. Next slide, if you could. Oh, do you want me to do it?
You have the pointer.
Oh, I have a pointer. Sorry. Technologically challenged. Just the right button?
The right button.
Okay. Do I point at you? Okay. I'll point at the screen.
Yeah.
Point at the screen. Okay. You can tell this is going to take a minute. One of the pieces of the puzzle of the book, I start very early on in the post-war order by taking on one of the basic assumptions that we make about the post-war order, and that is it was completely established by the United States. And especially those of you who are historians will know that in Northeast Asia, it was established by a whole lot of other actors. So to understand what happened in the wake of World War II in Northeast Asia specifically, you really have to go back to the wartime conferences. You have to go to Yalta and look at Stalin and Roosevelt. You have to go obviously to the Cairo meeting with Shanghai, which included Chiang Kai-shek, right? And then obviously to Potsdam, where the terms of Japan's surrender were negotiated. The bartering over territory began in Yalta between the United States and the Soviet Union. And I think a lot, we forget about that period. We often just let it sit when we focus on the peace treaty, but it's important to remember that wartime leaders, generals, and diplomats all were part of the mix, and it began during the war. Obviously in Japan, you have the emperor. The emperor's role, of course, is significant, as is his, military leaders and diplomats as well. And then finally, there's a group that we have less understanding of, but historians are beginning to tell us the story of. And that's the leaders that were emerging in the Japanese colonies of South Korea and Taiwan. The idea of, and mainland China, of course, is where we saw that emerge in a civil war later on. But you're starting to see independence leaders begin to make claims of their ambitions and their designs on what a post-war order ought to look like. They don't have the ears of most of the Allied powers necessarily, but they certainly have ideas about what the rights and wrongs are, especially when it comes to territory. Try this again. Aha. Thank you. But the post-war period, leaving the war behind us, and there is going to be, I'm going to write a chapter that's all about that historical moment. But leaving that behind us, if you think about who's actually tried to challenge the understandings, the diplomatic compromises that were negotiated that find their way into treaties, it's really been citizens, Japanese citizens, South Korean citizens, Chinese citizens, right? And they're local and they're national. But mostly they're local, and most of the challenges that are dedicated on the territorial issues are done by local citizens and local political leaders. There are obviously activists. I won't talk about that too much today because I don't think those are larger players in this case study. And ultimately, in some parts of this, the post-war order is challenged in national courts. But this is my way of saying, we don't have to look to another power emerging in the last 20 years to understand that there are trend lines here that we should be paying attention to that really give us the undercurrents of why the post-war order is beginning to fray. So the whys are fairly easy. In wartime, diplomatic compromises are required. Citizens are not always aware of them. Many times they feel they've been done in secrecy, and those are American citizens as much as the citizens of the Northeast Asian nations we're talking about. Once you get beyond that point, though, once you have your treaties and your documents, right, and the lines demarcating your territory from somebody else's, your reparations from your accountability and reparations, you begin to have citizens say, no, what you agreed to is unacceptable, or what you agreed to needs to be compensated for. And so these are appeals that don't necessarily go to Beijing or to Washington or to Tokyo even. They may be very, very focused on the regional governments because that's where citizens look for change. The other piece of the puzzle, and this is the last I'll say on this why question, is that citizens reassess the costs and benefits of the compromises that were made. And again, to give you the American example, it's very clear that the American public is beginning to reassess the costs, perceived costs of defending allies, offering strategic protection, which was very much a part of the post-war order in East Asia. So these are the kinds of questions that I'll be dealing with in detail in the book. But let's just today talk about uncertain boundaries, which is one chapter in my book about the legacy and the challenge of the post-war order. Just as a show of hands, how many of you have been to Merow? Yay! We have, yay, of course. All right, for those of you who haven't, this is a really quick map. You know where they are. Here is Merow over there, right by Christina, right? All the way up here. I am going to talk about Misaki, which is this one. Christina very nicely introduced the island. So there's Habumai, Shikodan, and then Kunashiri and Edo. The biggest of those islands is Etorofu, probably about 3 times the size of the main Okinawa island, for those of you who know Okinawa. It's a very large space. Habumai is a series of rocks and they're flat. Surprisingly, almost 7,000 people lived there prior to the end of the war. There's nothing there. It's flat as can be. So the weather is severe. So it's a very treacherous place to live. Both Kunashiri and Etorofu are volcanic islands. So you have a volcanic mountain in the middle, right? You have the configuration of islands that you see around the Japanese archipelago, north and south. Kunashiri is about a couple of 100 square kilometers bigger than the main island of Okinawa. So Kunashiri would be the closest in size to an island that we would all be able to imagine. It is surprising, but the Habumai, there's a tiny little island here. It has a tiny little and somewhat decrepit lighthouse on it. And that is only 3.7 kilometers from the coast of Hokkaido. It's very, very close. Kunashiri, and this is where Christina and I probably both were so impressed with the view that you get. These islands are right there. You feel like you can reach out and touch them. Some of the residents of this island here actually swam right, to Hokkaido. There have been several cases of individuals who decided to leave Russia and they swam. So they swam 16 kilometers or so. They're good swimmers in cold water, but it's that close. It's really that close. And I've always looked at it on a map, but when you actually go up there, the proximity and the reminder every day that those islands are right there and that Japanese used to live there, it's really quite overwhelming. See if I can. We all know these signs. The signs are everywhere. This is the penguin who is the mascot of the Northern Territories. Apparently every island has their own penguin with their own names, but this is the caricature that you see, the character that you see that's being used by the local government. These signs were all the way from the airport, all across my drive, all the way up to Merow. So they were pretty pervasive, but this is on the peninsula on my way to Cape Nosatu. Let's talk a little bit about the local advocates, because this is where I wanted to focus. I wanted to understand the resettlement, the families that were resettled in the wake of World War II, and they were resettled specifically to Merow. They were assigned that as their location to rebuild their lives by the Japanese government. At that time, it was about 17,000 in total who came off of the Northern Territories. They came off of the Northern Territories in different ways. Some of the fishermen, most of them were fishermen as for their livelihood. Some of them got into their fishing boats and left when they knew the Soviets were coming. Others were detained and then later were resettled, were repatriated by the Soviets at the time. This is the beginning. This is the man who began the campaign or the movement for the return of the Northern Territories to Japanese sovereignty. He's a mayor of Merow City, kind of grim looking face, but very dedicated activist, politician and activist, Mr. Ando Ishisuke. But he wrote a letter to General MacArthur. So remember, Japan is still under occupation at this time, asserting that the Habumai, Shikotan, Kunashiri, and Edorofu are part of Hokkaido, and that 3 to 5 generations of Japanese had been settled there and built their lives there. So this is the beginning where you can trace the beginning of a claim being made, and it was made under occupation at the time. But this was the first move in the idea that a movement needed to be created. This is, for those of you who are interested, this is from the museum that is at the Misaki, at the place where you look over at Habumai, and it's run by the local government. So all kinds of photographs from the time people lived on the territories, but also the history of this. The predominant source of livelihood is fishing. Makes sense. And this is the catch. For those of you, anybody from Hokkaido, there's a fish called memme that I couldn't find in the dictionary. Apparently it's a Hokkaido name for a fish. I think it's going to end up being Saudi, but I'm not sure. But this is the variety of catch. So some of the fishing that's being done, and I'll show you in just a second, is very close to the shore in rather shallow waters. Other fishing require deep sea trawlers. We go further from the coast and in more dangerous waters. This is what Christina was talking about when she said Shiretoko Peninsula is what you see up here. Okay. And some of the richest fishing grounds in the north, right? If we're standing, I'm looking at it from Merow City, looking out over, and this ice and ice flows are coming down from the Kamchatka Peninsula. So the Coast Guard has to have an icebreaker up there. It's a very hard place to fish. Most of the good fishing is actually in the winter. If you're a aficionado of fatty tuna and things like that, you know that cold waters are great. But uni, right? All kinds of really expensive Japanese fish and seafood are caught up there. But it is it is a very busy fishing area, both in the shallow waters as well as in the deeper waters. This is one of the places where the Russians and Japanese have come to a little bit of tension these days. Kelp is harvested there, but it is supposedly the best kelp in Japan, sold or is being taken from this location. This is Habumai, so again, 3.7 kilometers off the coast. You'll see a little lighthouse at the top there. That's the Kaigara, that's the island. And it's around that island that the best kelp fishing is done. It's seasonal, it's in May. And so fishermen who may go deep sea fishing will be very focused on the kelp harvest at a particular moment in time. Now, the reason I'm telling you all about kelp is that this has been a place where the Russians and the Japanese have never really had a lot of tension. The Russians don't fish for kelp. There is a Japanese side of the median line, which I'll show you in just a second, and a Russian side. And the boats have typically gone back and forth around this lighthouse during the season, and they're observed by the Russian Coast Guard. And they've always been observed, but they're not necessarily policed that strongly because A, Russians don't eat kelp, they don't harvest it, and B, it is such a short season. This has changed of late. These are the larger trawlers. Most of you who've been in a fishing village in Japan will know. These are lights, they go on at night, octopus, other kinds of fish. But these trawlers leave Merow and they go to the Sea of Okhotsk to the north, but they also go out west to the Sea of Japan and they go out east into the Pacific Ocean. So these are deep water fishing boats. They're large. The maritime dilemma, bringing us back to Japan-Russia relations. The maritime dilemma is maritime boundaries are actually quite hard to police. And it doesn't matter if you agree on your boundary or you disagree on your boundary. The vastness of the ocean, and specifically if you're looking at the Indo-Pacific, maritime boundary management is a difficult capacity for most nations to develop, even rich nations like Japan. The way in which the Japanese and the Russians, show you this, have managed their border, and I would say to be very correct here, the Japanese government does not recognize this as a national border, right? This is the line, you can see, sorry. This is what the Japanese government will refer to as the median line. It does not recognize, obviously, because it doesn't recognize this is Russian sovereignty. It does not recognize this is the correct maritime boundary between Russia and Japan. Instead, they go back to a bilateral treaty of 1855. And that is the official position of the Japanese government. Nonetheless, Japanese fishermen need to stay within the Hokkaido side of that red line. Otherwise, they could be subject to policing by the Russian Coast Guard and fined, and in worst cases, harmed. There is very little military presence in the region. This is largely border patrol. So law enforcement, the Coast Guard are the main agency in Japan. These young men helped me and showed me their ship, told me where they went. One of the big pieces of the puzzle up here is the depth. So that large expanse of ocean or water that you saw is actually quite shallow. So you've got the dual problem of ships getting in trouble because the waters are too shallow, and obviously in the wintertime the ice flows. So they spend an awful lot of time making sure the fishermen are safe, but also if fishermen are on the other side of that median line, the Coast Guard's job is to remind them that they're not supposed to be there. Now, anecdotally, if you meet with some fishermen and hear their stories, and of course, stories can get big like fish, right? So I'm not sure what, this is anecdotes, and so I want to make sure that you understand it's not hard data. But generationally, you get very different stories from the fishermen about their experiences with the Russians. And but there have been confiscations, right? There isn't a lot of military activity, mostly because then the Admiral here, Sugimoto-san will correct me if I'm wrong, but it's very hard for maritime self-defense force ships to go through because the waters are shallow, first of all. And second of all, and we'll get to this later, the Russians have begun to beef up their weapons on these islands. So basically, this is a Coast Guard job, patrolling the boundary. To my knowledge, and I asked the question of the Japanese Coast Guard, have you ever confiscated or stopped a Russian fisherman on the Japanese side of the median line? And they said, no, no, rather unheard of. What they encounter Russian fishermen who need search and rescue assistance, or they need to be broken out of the ice and other kinds of problems. So they see themselves more as working in terms of public safety. There is a lot of local problem solving that involves the Coast Guards of both Russians and Japanese. I was really struck by one example that the Coast Guard gave me, which is in the 1970s, both the Russians and the Japanese governments were worried about the black market trade in fishing from the north. In other words, neither country could regulate either side of the maritime boundary. And this was largely Aksa. It was run by Aksa, and Merow was apparently full of representatives from some of the major crime families. But it was a lot of money. It was high profit, illicit trading. And so the Japanese and Soviet, at that time, Soviet Coast Guards cooperated to the eradication of the activity. That was a decade-long prospect, and according to the Coast Guard, it ended up to the satisfaction of both sides. A little bit less cooperative is in 2006, where the Russian border patrols killed a Japanese fisherman. They claim that he was on board a ship that was poaching. Again, it was around that little lighthouse island, Kaigara. The captain was detained for a month and a half, and he was tried in a Russian court. His boat was confiscated and he was fined 2 million yen, but he was accused of poaching. He came back to Merow without his boat and basically said, I was forced to make a confession so I could leave. So you have that death, and it's a relatively recent one. It's not in the 1950s and 60s, it's 2006. So that is a situation where there wasn't a lot of communication back and forth, and the Japanese Coast Guard or the local Merow city government, which usually has a channel, could not communicate with the authorities and could not get the captain released until the trial was over. The last one is a more recent example, and this is a little bit more cooperative, but it's kind of a mixed bag. So in 2022, not 2023, but in 2022, you all probably know that there was a big accident of a tour boat, Japanese tour boat up there off the Sheila National Park, where Christina went. 26 people were on board, 20 people were confirmed dead, and 6 people are still missing. So Japanese side, Japanese tour boat, tour operator. The Japanese Coast Guard asked the Russian Coast Guard to cooperate in search and rescue because the currents are very strong there. And the Russians said, we will allow you to do search and rescue on the other side, on our side of the median line, but we will not help you. At the end of the day, though, there were several bodies were found on the shores of Kunashiri. And the Russian Coast Guard then reached out to the Japanese Coast Guard and met them at the median line to return the bodies. So there's evidence here that you've got a mixed bag in terms of cooperation, and especially more recently, of course, this happened after the Russian invasion. So you wouldn't expect it to be cooperative, but it was more cooperative than perhaps we should think. Now, the second, that's the maritime boundary management set of problems and issues and agents. The former islanders are who I really wanted to talk to when I went up there. And there is an association called Chishima Renmei. It's a longer name of the association of those returning from the Tsushima Islands. Tsushima is 1,000 islands. It references not just the 4 northern territories, but all of the Kurils, or that's the Japanese name for what the Russians refer to as the Kurils. So Kamchatka Peninsula all the way down. But these are people who were who evacuated from or were resettled from the 4 islands that we referenced at the beginning. They, as I noted, are largely fishermen. Their advocacy was for Japanese government assistance to help them resettle, to make it possible for them to start their businesses again. And so they began to ask the Japanese government for subsidies, for low interest loans, for whatever help the government could offer. In 1961, a new law was passed that allowed for this kind of lending by the Japanese state to these, particularly to the former island residents. We can talk more about that if you'd like. The fishing, most of it was surrounding fishing. It has expanded since then to include other types of businesses, farms, right? Any kind of seafood processing. So business loans in general now, it's not only tied to fishing rights. I was lucky enough to speak to, as I said, there I am, in all my glory. I couldn't figure out a way to chop me out of the picture, so forgive me for that. But I met just by chance in the port. For those of you doing field work, your PhD, or you're doing other kinds of work, these are the moments. Because I couldn't get the head of the Merow Fishing Collaborative to meet with me. But nope, thank you very much, American researcher. No, thank you. No politics for me. So I was wandering after my Coast Guard, before my Coast Guard meeting, I was wandering around the port and I saw some fishermen bringing in their nets. So I approached and I said, excuse me, I'm this American researcher. I'm here to talk about fishing. And I had the best reception by this man who's not pictured here, a young fisherman by the name of, ironically, Mr. Minato. Perfect name. For those of you who don't speak Japanese, it's Mr. Harbor. That's his name. And what else could you want? Anyway, so this is why I have a next generation slide, because he then brought his parents, mostly his father did the talk and his mom was there, but they brought different generations, and we had a nice long conversation about what fishermen were experiencing on the water. Again, anecdotal stories, but the evolution of concern by these fishermen about the Russians and the Russian behavior is twofold. One, the older generation would be arrested and not come back. And that was obviously because there wasn't a peace treaty, Christina mentioned in the introduction. And until there was a diplomatic agreement that had a more favorable Japan-Russia relationship, if you got nabbed by the Russians and you were a fisherman, and that was 2 generations ago, right? You weren't quite sure what was going to happen, right? And this is not only a Russia-Japan problem, this was a Japan-South Korea problem in the 50s and 60s until the agreement was concluded with Korea and Japan in 65 as well. So fishermen have been, put it a different way, fishermen have been on the front line when diplomacy is unfulfilled, put it that way, when there is no formal state-to-state negotiation of the rules of the game in a maritime region in particular, right? Then the fishermen are out there on their own. And very often they meet agents from the other side, government officials from the other side, or they meet other fishermen, right? And they don't have a lot of protection out there. So that was the grandfather era story. The father of this generation that I'm showing you here, this guy is in his 20s, by the way, he's late 20s, coming up on 30. His father had a very cooperative relationship with the Russians. His father was the head of the fishing cooperative that he now is working for. His father was also a fisherman on a boat. And that's the kind of heyday of the 1990s, when there was an awful lot of negotiated compromise, and there was an openness by the Russians and the Japanese to find a cooperative, maybe not a sovereignty related decision, but a cooperative structure in which the islanders and those who were in Merow could find common cause. Much more, I wish the Japanese government would stay out of it. Let us handle it here locally, but a very much more positive, more optimistic rendering of that border management. If you just let us deal with it, we will come to our own agreements and we'll be fine. This generation now, he was not on a ship, Mr. Minato was on a boat. This generation now is more worried about the lack of the government's ability to find stability in the relationship, even with all of those meetings between Putin and Abe at the high politics level. The anxiety of younger fishermen has grown. They don't have channels on the islands themselves, and they also have more accidents and more problems that they don't see that their governments can help them resolve, and that they don't have the capacity to negotiate on behalf of. So this next generation is important because you see over time, you have very different generational approaches to whether or not that relationship is manageable or not. I'm going to speed up a little bit because I know I'm taking probably too much time. The national politics I can come back to. I think many of you are more familiar with the national politics. This is not a subject that we need to spend a lot of time on, other than there has been a creation in the 1980s of a position, a cabinet position dedicated to Okinawa and the Northern Territories, right? So that is something that you see. There have been a lot of visits by cabinet members. This goes back to the early 1980s. For those of you who know your politician, those of you from Japan who know your politicians well, recognize Mr. Botoda here, right? Suzuki Zenko is up there. You have a whole slew of cabinet members who would go up to the north to demonstrate their concern and the optics, right? To have the pictures taken about their concern about the Northern Territories. But more formally, there is a Northern Territories Day now, and it is held not just by people who care about it or the activists or local officials and residents. It's held by the Japanese government. It's sponsored by the Japanese government, and it is held on February 7th every year. Why? Because that 1855 treaty between Japan and Russia was completed on February 7th. So February 7th is the Northern Territories Day, and here you see Prime Minister Sheila this year addressing the Now, again, we can talk about this in the discussion, and I'm going to conclude with a couple of specifics on the military front. And again, I'm going to rush through this a little bit. The Russian Defense Forces have a larger presence now on these Northern Territories than they've had in the past. It's mostly a defensive position. The Japanese have not, obviously, upped their forces on the Hokkaido side. The fishing patrols I've shared with you, there's a little bit more Russian intervention of the traditional fishing, even the kelp fishing. Fishermen are told not to bring cell phones, not to bring their smartphones. And so the fishing cooperatives would now give the fishermen flip phones with no camera ability, because the Russian border patrol don't want to be photographed. So that's one of these little tweaks are the way in which this is moving forward. Russia has retracted the right of innocent passage. So if anybody here is a maritime law or a UN law of the sea expert, you'll know exactly what that means. But the right of innocent passage is what most sovereign states give to civilian ships passing through straits or narrow waters. And as long as you're communicating your intent and who you are assumed that you will have the right of innocent passage. The Russians rescinded that from around Crimea and the Baltic after it invaded Crimea, or annexed Crimea, whatever the correct verb is there. And they have just last couple of weeks or so done that to the Kurils as well. So the Kuril Islands now, the Russians say they will no longer grant the right of innocent passage through those waters that we saw. That's just for those of you, any defense folks in the room. Edwin is where the anti-ship missiles that were deployed in 2017. So you can see here what the range of that is. It's not just simply to send a missile to Merow. Obviously, it has larger strategic impact. Some concluding thoughts, and we can let this lead us into discussion, and I'll go through it very fast, right? The stakes were very, very high at between and among the major powers at the end of World War II. But it was a much more fluid settlement until you get to the actual end of the war in Northeast Asia. In other words, the Soviets basically continued, right, to assert their right to have control over the what we think of Northern Territories, but their Far East. Stalin was very fixed on Japanese military power and did not want to have the Japanese access to the Russian Far East. Japanese resentment against the Soviets continues, even though I wouldn't say today it's a palpable public social movement in Japan. It is still their memory, and that memory is also lingering on the Russian side as well. And you'll hear Putin make reference to the Russo-Japanese War in ways that I find quite striking about Japanese military potential. But I think what I wanted to tell you here is the local needs are largely one of the pieces of the puzzle that drives the government action. It's not simply a geostrategic balancing act. Local needs have been a large part of the Japanese government's response, but they have been also a little bit of the Russian government's response. Japanese strategic options are limited, but the Abe 15 meetings between Abe and Putin was a direct desire by Abe to pull Russia away from what we see today, which is the no limits friendship between Russia and China. The Japanese understood that this would be bad for their security, and Abe tried very, very hard, not necessarily just to settle the territory, but to make sure to offer to Vladimir Putin a friend in the Northeast Asian region, and he wouldn't have to rely solely on China. We have seen, as you know, that relation now consolidate between China and Russia. Let me stop there because that's a very quick sort of sweep in terms of a conclusion, but I want to hear people's thoughts and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a broad sweep on both the geopolitics and the local politics, which are critical to understanding this complex problem. We are going to lead off with a question from Mr. Takayuki Sugimoto, who is the former Vice Admiral of the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces and is here at Harvard this year as a senior fellow at the Harvard Asia Center.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. The return of the northern territories is also becoming more difficult in practical terms. And it's a very good chance for me to ask you. So I will just ask one big picture question. How do you define this current era? Is this interwar era of the World War, an era of much conflict before the World War? Or is that the beginning of the new war? Or it's a second Cold War, as it's often called? What is your definition of the era?
Oh dear.
Not about territories.
I wish I knew the answer to that question. I think a lot of us are a little worried that we might be in a new era of major power competition and conflict. I think if you're sitting in Washington and you're sitting in the Pentagon, of course, you would say it is major power competition, not war. So that strategic competition, as you know, has many dimensions to it, one of which, of course, is the military balance. I think it's also true, I would say it's also true, as you see today, Xi Jinping land in Europe, that Xi Jinping would like to see less societies and countries aligned with the United States. He's very overtly advocating for that. Vladimir Putin has also begun to be very bold in his desire to undermine the existing order and to break up the West, right? So he has a lot of anti-Western rhetoric, much of which is about the United States, but not all of it. Part of it's about Europe and NATO countries as well. So are we on the verge of war? I think I would like to say no. There's a big pause in the room. Silence. But I think it's important to understand that major power dynamics are not the only determinant of major conflicts, as you know better probably than anybody. It can take an accident, a miscalculation, an archduke getting assassinated. I mean, if you think about what we now refer to as the world wars, right? Often they came at with a very small incident that then blew up and couldn't be contained. And I think as I sit in the policy world, my argument is that nothing is predetermined, nothing is inescapable. And therefore we need to make sure that we have the ability not only to deter aggression, but to control the escalation should there be an accident or miscalculation or an event that sets out public sentiment in a way that might be hard for politicians to handle. That's the job of diplomacy. That's the job of our political leaders, right? And so I think we're in an era where our political leaders may be a little bit more interested in whipping up sort of sentiments, right? But I think our strategic planners are very carefully trying to make sure that we have communication, that we have ways of stepping back in case there's an incident. We can talk more about this with the China relationship if you'd like. But so I'm not sure I have any of your I'm not sure any of your characterizations would be one that I would say, aha, it's that one. Because I think we're in a moment of trying to determine how to navigate intensified major power conflict, but I'm not sure we're quite ready to put a name on it yet. Sorry.
My question on this point is one of the characteristics of the new order that Japan has tried to emphasize, or of the old order that it wants to preserve, is a rule-based order.
Right.
And so you've been mentioning geopolitics, or we need diplomacy.
Right.
But the question of the Northern Territories is also one of international law.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you could address whether that has made this easier or harder to solve, because Japan has multiple territorial conflicts, and the question of whether it would win one or the other if taken to the International Court of Justice, what precedents should be set. And in this dispute, do you think that has the international law been a positive or negative force towards reaching a compromise?
So I would say, and again, I'm not an international legal scholar, but I will answer the question. Anyway, so please correct me if you have legal scholars in the room. So international law, and I'm glad you mentioned the International Court of Justice, because there are precedents around the globe, not in Northeast Asia, but around the globe, of countries who could not sort out their borders. Land borders, maritime borders. You have it in the Mediterranean, you have it in Africa. Many countries, obviously in Africa, they had imposed borders that didn't work, and they needed to get it resolved. Both parties go to the ICJ because they say they will accept third-party mediation and adjudication. So I think if you're a political leader and you take a case to the court, but your public doesn't accept it, you have a problem. But it requires both sides to be willing to commit to whatever the resolution is, we will accept it. Now, the Japanese government has said to the Korean government, let's take Dokdo, or Takeshima as it's known by the Japanese, let's take that case, right, and see what happens. Now, the Koreans will say, no, thank you. We don't want to do that. Japan has never said, let's take the Senkaku Island issue to the International Court. And similarly with the Northern Territories. Now, I can't tell you if the ICJ heard the case on the Northern Territories, how they would rule, or what precedents under international law they may look to find, right, reference. The Japanese government position, however, is in treaty after treaty after treaty with the Russians, right? There was a demarcation, at least between those 4 Northern Territories and the one that's between Etorofu and the Russian, what the Japanese think of as Russian Kurils. If you therefore do a diplomatic history deep dive, as the Japanese government would like to do, then the preceding treaty before World War II would be your place to go. San Francisco never acknowledged the Northern Territories as Russian territory. But then the Russians didn't sign, the Soviets didn't sign the San Francisco Peace Treaty, right? Which is why you don't have a peace treaty to this day between Japan and today's Russia. So I think the ICJ is a great place to think about going if you are confident on both sides that your governments and your people will accept the outcome. I'm not sure that would be the case in the Northern Territories, right?
All right, let's open up to more questions. I'll ask each person to introduce themselves and ask one question. Oh, yes.
Hi, my name is Mayumi Fukushima. I'm a postdoc fellow at the Harvard Belfast Center. I believe I met you back in 2016 in Atlanta. Thank you for your time back then and for your presentation, great presentation today. So my question is how you would explain why those, Northern Territory issues have not been resolved so far. And, I think the classic explanation for why this hasn't been resolved is basically, the Japan's lack of military power, right? Like, basically Japanese government military doesn't have sufficient power to take on Russia, or maybe United States is not willing to support Japan on the issue. And I think this has been reflected in Kishida's new concept of like realism diplomacy for new era. And he admits that, you know, for diplomatic demands to be effective, those demands got to be backed by military power, right? But it seems to me that you seem to challenge this idea to say that maybe the concept of Robert Putnam's two-level game might be better, right? Because he focuses on his citizens, right? And the reason why this hasn't been resolved, maybe because lack of citizen power to pressure the government, maybe the collective action problem or something like that. So could you clarify on that? Do you think?
There's a lot in that question. Let me see where it starts. Let me start just picking up on a couple of aspects of your question. So is it unresolved because Japan has no military power? I would say I would find that a hard argument to make. That even a more militarily forward-leaning Japan would have a hard time retaking the islands and then defending them. That you could have a huge debate, and I hope the Admiral will join that conversation, but why would that help Japan strategically to take those 4 islands back and then have its military concentrated on the border with Russia? Because once Japan would take it back, it would have to defend it, right? It's a very hard place to defend, as the Japanese learned at the end of World War II. It was a very hard place for the Russians to actually take, even though it seems like it might be easy. And the Russian, forces were vast at the time. They had been reorganized from Europe to the Far East. So I'm not sure the military power argument works for me, that it's just a question of military power will convince the Russians to give it back. That's a different sort of corollary to your suggestion. I think it's interesting to me, and I don't know I have a definitive answer on this, but Putin has been has repeatedly made reference to Japan's military potential. The fear of Japanese military power. And it's a reference that you see in the literature that I read about World War II as well. Stalin feared Japanese military power and wanted to protect his Far East from it. So the fear of Japanese potential military power is definitely in the Russian mindset, if you will, as they think about Japan. So I'm not sure it's not irrelevant. I'm not sure your point is irrelevant. I do not formally use two-level games because I'm not trying to explain why the Northern Territories hasn't been resolved in this book. The larger meta focus of the book is the fraying of the post-war order. And for me, that is to tell people that the rise and fall of powers is not the only game in town. The geopolitics matter, to be sure. But there's a whole other way in which the normative basis of that post-war order is being challenged. And the primary agents, the agency of that challenge is much more forcefully the citizens of South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, right? And to a lesser extent, mainland China. So it's not a two-level game in sort of this is how the citizens pressure the state and this is why it gets resolved. That's not what I'm trying to explain here. So that may be, frustrating if you're a Robert Putnam fan, because I'm not trying to say why it's solved or not solved. What is interesting to me is the local experience, why the local problem set and the national diplomatic goals are often not in sync with each other. And what that says to a larger Japanese public in this case, because this is the case I was doing, why the larger Japanese public often takes on the more diplomatic national sovereignty kind of claim, but doesn't necessarily invest in the kind of citizen advocacy that's coming from the local area. Now, the one exception, and all of you who know this, is Suzuki Munio. Suzuki Munio loves Russia. Suzuki Munio goes to Russia, has good ties in Russia, and even after the sanctions went to Russia. Why? Because he thinks that's where the solution for the livelihood of the people of northern Hokkaido rests, right? In the hands of Moscow. Is he well liked because of that? No, not so much. Not in Tokyo anyway, right? So you've got all kinds of agency here that's more complex, I think, and that's just the picture I was trying to draw a little bit for you today. You're welcome.
Let's take 2 short questions. So I'll ask you to hold your response. It's Sayumi.
Hi, I am Sayumi Merow, a postdoc at the US Supreme Program. So some people have this naive belief that waiting can help. But in terms of thinking about the national level and local level, do you think weighting helps or harms in what ways at each level between national and?
Waiting as in waiting. Oh, I just want to understand the question. Waiting as in waiting for Moscow to say yes.
Or just like the time passage and the generations.
Okay,
Thank you.
yes,
Hi, I'm Gene. I'm a PhD candidate here. I'm actually writing my dissertation on fisheries disputes between Japan and South Korea, so.
Excellent. I will be looking for your email after you. Go ahead.
So when I've spoken with Japan fisheries agency people or fishery associations in other parts of Japan, a lot of them are really concerned about the decline of the fishing industry and how fishers and fishing communities are becoming politically less important and economically less important. I'm wondering if you saw similar concerns among the communities that you interviewed, and looking forward, the trajectory of change in the fishing industry in these areas, if that affects the importance of these issues.
It's a great question.
and let me bring on our online question.
Oh,
and
there's
then
an online
we'll
question. Yes, I
answer
will.
all three,
I
although
will.
this follows nicely. Tim Webster says,
Hi, Tim.
thanks, Sheila. Could you elaborate on Japanese reactions to Russia after Ukraine? You note Russia has increased boardings, retracted rights of innocent passage on Japanese fishermen. Most, but not all Japanese companies have joined the sanctions on Russia after Ukraine. Are Japanese folks in Hokkaido looking to apply pressure on Russian actors? Or is the Ukraine war seen as distant and important conflict from Hokkaido? All right, three questions and we'll
Excellent. I'll go
give you
fast.
5 minutes.
Okay, 1 minute for answer. Waiting has not resolved the issue. And I think there were moments in the history of this where obviously the 1950s and the Hatoyama negotiations didn't pan out the way I think Mr. Hatoyama in particular, but others in Japan had hoped. And that was the intervention of the United States, by the way. We got in the way of that in the 50s. But I think there's always been this idea of a soft cooperative approach. So whether it's the two-island approach, which goes back, as you know, to the 50s, or it's some other kind of joint economic development zone, something negotiated that would allow the people of Northern Hokkaido and the people of the island, those 4 islands, to have better lives or have some kind of interaction where sovereignty would recede and economic development would come to the fore. There've been all kinds of optimistic thought processes. I think Prime Minister Abe probably gave it the best diplomatic, high-level political effort in the post-war, since Hatoyama, to try to see whether or not there was a way through. Putin, I would say, led him on for a long time. Not sure that's an academic term, but and then walked away. But Putin also had an ask of Abe, which is a very high amount, $900 million immediately of Japanese foreign direct investment in the Far East, Soviet Far East. So there is a bartering aspect, whether waiting helps or doesn't help, not sure, but it's not necessarily going to just settle. It's going up and down and getting, the intersections are becoming less obvious between economic development and sovereignty. On the fisheries decline, great point. I mean, some of you may know, but I wrote about the Senkaku Islands in my book, Intimate Rivals. And I was there before the Chinese trawler captain blew up everything. And so I spent quite a bit of time with the fishermen in Ishigaki. So very similar. I would say Merow is a much more wealthy fishing community. It has to do with the catch, the nature of the catch. It's uni, it's kelp, it's very expensive, very profitable trade. The numbers, the overall population of Merow City is just under 30,000 people total, and probably about half that in terms of household number. I wouldn't be able to tell you today how many fishermen that is, because there's seafood processing and trade and all kinds of things organized around the actual fishermen themselves. So I would think that, yes, you've got decline, and you can certainly see decline in interest in the anecdotal stories I was hearing from the generations of fishermen. But that is one of the richest fishing towns in Japan, I would say, probably. I'd be willing to say it probably is, just because of the nature of the catch. So I think you're going to have less decline there, even though people are going to do other things. That next generation have choices. but many of them want to go into the fishing industry because it's lucrative, right? So that's a question, and we'll talk later. Russia, Tim, thanks for the question. I did not, so what I went there to ask was, what has been the impact of the sanctions on your livelihoods or your day-to-day? And so I shared some of that in some micro ways. One of the things the Russians have done is, of course, they've dubbed Japan an unfriendly country, right? But they've also dubbed the Tsushima Renmei as an unfriendly organization. I mean, they've called out the islanders organization, the civil society organization. And then lately, I haven't run it down yet to be sure, but there was another organization that apparently was identified by the Russians as well. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, Tim, but the fishermen were like, this is all just getting in the way. National governments, get out of the way. Don't care what you're doing with the Russians. We want to get our fishing done. So there's a pragmatic approach at the local level. I didn't hear a lot of, Slava Ukraine in Merow. Very little conversation. It was really very focused on the Russian piece of the Japanese relationship with Russia, not the overall, should there be sanctions on Russia or should we help Ukrainians, right? I don't know if that's just because that's what the local interests are all about. But I spent a lot more time talking about how the sanctions had affected day-to-day livelihoods and things like that, and the policing of the maritime boundary. So I didn't hear a lot about sympathy with the Ukrainians. I asked, anecdotally again, I asked people, do you think the Russians would go to war with Japan in Hokkaido? And everybody was incredulous at that idea. That was craziness. No, the Russians would never do something like that. But you have to understand that those northern territories, the Kuril Islands and Sakhalin, they're very impoverished. This is not Russia at its best, so to speak. It's not necessarily also where the Russian military is concentrating. Those islands are important for defensive purposes because you've got major bases in Kamchatka and then, of course, over in Vladivostok. The Kurils themselves are the islands are a barrier, a rim for defense for the Sea of Okhotsk. They are not in and of themselves a place where you're going to find large numbers of military forces. So I don't see that there's a lot of angst on the part of the residents of Merow about conflict or about direct military action against their city or their region, which is another way of looking at the problem. So the threat perception is not part of Merow, the conversations that I had in Merow.
Fascinating. So we know there's the fear of war starting from uncertainty, and you say this is a flashpoint, but the people who are there on the
Don't feel a
border
flashpoint.
are working out the problems and
Would prefer to have the national governments get out of the way. Right?
it's just fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation, and I am so glad that you have research on this topic and that we could join you. I know there's more questions, but it sounds like we can continue to ask you. And I also am wanting to thank our program for a great year. It has been wonderful, very much thanks to Megan Hodge, who has been running all of the behind the scenes work so that we can focus on these conversations, and Shinju Fujihira, who does everything so easily. And we are really just very grateful for all of the support for the program. And Sophie Welsh is not in the room, but she is also part of our program staff who helps to keep everything running smoothly. Susan Farr, our honorary senior advisor, who gives us advice to keep this live and running. Thank you, all the associates and those who've joined the community. It's great to have you and wonderful to end the year on such a positive, interesting discussion.
Thank you.